The good china came out on a Tuesday. Odessa May Bishop set 4 cups of sweet tea on a table that had belonged to a woman none of them had ever met in a stone house. None of them believed was real, and she poured slow the way her grandmother taught her, so the ice wouldn't crack the glass. Across from her sat the 3 people who had erased her. 6 months ago, they had watched a lawyer read her out of 40 years of marriage like she was a line item somebody forgot to delete. 6 months ago, they had called her the help, the secretary, the woman their father kept around. 6 months ago, they had given her a rusted key and 30 days to disappear. Now they were the ones who couldn't stop staring at the walls. Odessa slid a thick brown folder to the center of the table and folded her hands on top of it. "Before you decide to take me to court," she said, "there's something you ought to know about the land you're trying to claim." She didn't open the folder. She just let it sit there, brown and patient, while the ice settled in their glasses. Because here is the thing. They never understood about Odessa Bishop. The thing their father understood better than anyone alive. 6 months ago, this woman had nothing in the world but a rusted key and the deed to a house nobody would tell her the truth about. And the truth about that house was going to change everything. Odessa was 24 years old the first time she walked into the law offices of Bishop Ellery and Stone, and she almost turned right back around. It was the fall of 1984. She had exactly one good dress, navy blue, hemmed twice because she'd bought it secondhand, and a resume so thin you could read the paper through it. Community college in the mornings, a diner shift at night, and a landlord who had already told her that next month's rent was going up whether she liked it or not. The reception job paid better than the diner. That was the whole reason she was there. Harold Bishop came out of his office to get a cup of coffee, saw her sitting in the waiting room with her hands folded to keep them from shaking, and stopped. He was 39 years old then, a rising star in Atlanta real estate law, tall and unhurried in a gray suit that fit him the way money fits people who've had it a while. He looked at Odessa the way most well-off white men in that city did not look at a young black woman waiting for an interview. He looked at her like she was a person he'd been waiting for. "You're early," he said. "My mama always said early is on time and on time is late." The words came out before she could stop them. She wanted to sink into the floor. But Harold Bishop laughed. A real laugh surprised out of him. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was," Odessa said. "She passed 2 years ago." The laugh went soft on his face. "I'm sorry." "It's just me now," Odessa said, and she didn't know why she told him that a stranger in a waiting room. Maybe because it was true and she was tired of pretending it wasn't. Her father had died when she was 9. Her mother 2 years back. No brothers, no sisters. Her grandmother, Cornelia, the last of the people who had raised her, buried out behind a church in a town Odessa had left as a girl and never gone back to. She was as far as the world was concerned alone. "Well, Miss Freeman," Harold said, reading her name off the folder in his hand. "Let's see if we can't do something about that job at least." She got it. Of course she got it. And in the years that followed, she would sometimes wonder if he had already in that first minute decided something about her that she wouldn't understand for a very long time. They married in the summer of 1985, August 3rd, a small ceremony because Harold's people did not come, and Odessa had no people to come. She was 25, he was 40. She wore white and carried pecans instead of flowers because he asked her to, and when she asked him why, he only smiled and said, "Humor an old man, Des. I've got my reasons." She humored him. She spent 40 years humoring him, and it was only at the very end that she'd understand there had been reasons under the reasons the whole time. Harold had been married before. Gloria Prescott of the Buckhead Prescotts, a family with old Atlanta money and older Atlanta opinions. Gloria had died young, a car accident, when the children were still small, and by the time Odessa came along, the 3 of them were half raised by their grandmother Prescott, in a house where the word secretary was said the way other people say a slur. Darnell was 18, Yolanda 15, Curtis a boy of 11. The grandmother taught them what to think of the woman their father brought home, and she taught them well. Odessa learned early what she was to them. Not a stepmother, not family. An embarrassment their father had picked up and refused to put down. "You'll never be our mother," Yolanda told her at the wedding, 13 years old, with her grandmother's ice in her voice. "So don't you dare try." Odessa tried anyway. Lord, she tried. She remembered every birthday. She sat through every graduation in the back row and clapped until her hands hurt. She kept their childhood rooms exactly as they'd left them, dusted the trophies laundered, the curtains cooked Thanksgiving for people who arrived late and left early, and never once said thank you. She swallowed 40 years of small cruelties the way you swallow a bitter pill fast so you don't taste it. Remarks about her schooling, remarks about where she came from, remarks when they thought she couldn't hear about what a woman like that must have done to land a man like their father. And through all of it, she built what she believed was a marriage. The house in Buckhead was Harold's before he met her, a big brick colonial with white columns and a lawn that ate up Saturdays. Odessa made it a home. She hosted his colleagues and his clients, learned which judge took his bourbon neat, and which senator's wife was allergic to shellfish, learned to be gracious and warm, and just invisible enough that nobody in that world ever felt threatened by her. Harold was good to her in his way. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He made sure she had proper clothes and a reliable car, and never had to worry about the rent that had once kept her up at night. But there was a room in him she never got into. He kept a home office at the back of the house that was his and his alone. "I need one space that's just mine. Des, you understand." She understood. She always understood. She dusted the hallway outside that door for 40 years and stepped inside it maybe 5 times. And one of those times she would remember this. Later would remember it so hard it hurt. She saw a small mason jar on the shelf behind his desk, half full of dirt. Red dirt, the deep rust color you don't see much around Atlanta. "What's this?" she'd asked. "Soil," he'd said, easy as anything. "From a client's property. Sentimental value. His, not mine." And he'd steered her out and shut the door, and she'd forgotten about it for 30 years. He kept separate accounts, too. When she asked about money once early on, he patted her hand like she was a girl asking about grown folks' business. "Don't you worry your pretty head, darling. Money's my job. Making this a home is yours, and you do it perfectly." So she didn't worry. She trusted him the way you trust a person you've handed your whole life to, even the trips. Once a month, sometimes more. Harold would pack a bag and go off fishing, he said, with some men from a hunting club he never named. He'd be gone a Friday to a Sunday and come back rested, in a way she never saw him rest at home. He never brought back a single fish. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But when she teased him about it, he only kissed the top of her head and said the fish weren't biting, and every single August, for 40 years, he would come home from one of those trips with a fresh green branch of pecans and lay it on the kitchen counter without a word. She thought it was sweet. A little strange, a little sweet. Her husband and his pecans. She never once asked where a man goes fishing and comes home with pecans instead of fish. That she would learn far too late was the whole story. She just hadn't known how to read it yet. There was one more thing, and it was the smallest of all. Sometime in their 2nd year of marriage, Harold asked her about her people. They were lying in bed late the way you talk in the dark when you've decided to trust somebody. She told him about her grandmother Cornelia, who'd raised her after her mama's health went bad. About the stories Cornelia used to tell a place with pecan trees, so old their branches touched the ground. A stone well you could see your face in a whole town of folks who owned their own land back when that was close to a miracle. "They took it," Odessa said into the dark. "I don't know all how. Grandma Cornelia never would say the whole of it. Just that one day it was ours and the next day it wasn't, and we scattered." "What was it called?" Harold asked. His voice was very quiet. "This place." "Beulah," she said, and she felt herself smile in the dark just saying it. "Beulah, Georgia. Grandma used to sing about it. I'm living on the mountain underneath a cloudless sky." She hummed a little of the old hymn. She said it was named for the first freeman woman to hold the deed. My great-great something. Cornelia. Same as Grandma. They passed the name down like it was land itself. Harold was quiet for a long time. "Spell it for me," he finally said. "Your grandmother's maiden name, the whole family." "Freeman," she said, half laughing. Freeman. "Why, no reason," he said. "Curious is all." And she heard him in the dark get up and go to his office. She heard the scratch of his pen. She thought nothing of it. Her husband worked odd hours. The man was always writing something down. She fell asleep. She forgot the whole conversation by Christmas. But something else began around then, so small she never thought to question it. Harold took to humming that same old hymn, "I'm living on the mountain underneath a cloudless sky," under his breath, while he shaved, while he drove, while he read the paper on Sunday mornings. She figured he'd simply caught the tune from her the way married people catch each other's songs. She never once asked why a man who'd never set foot in Beulah would carry its hymn in his mouth for the next 40 years. 40 years later, in a stone house she didn't know existed, she would remember every single word. Harold Bishop died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2025. 3 months shy of his 80th birthday. Odessa found him. She'd brought him his coffee at 7 the way she had every morning for 40 years, and he was gone. Peaceful, the doctor said later, his heart quick and quiet, no pain. She stood over the bed holding a cup of coffee that was still steaming and felt something she was ashamed of, something under the grief that she pushed down so fast she almost convinced herself she never felt it. It felt for one terrible second like relief. The funeral was enormous. Harold had been one of Atlanta's great real estate attorneys for half a century, and it seemed like half the city came. Judges, developers, 2 former mayors. Colleague after colleague stood up to speak, and every one of them talked about Harold Bishop. The brilliant mind Harold Bishop, the pillar, Harold Bishop, the devoted father. Not one of them mentioned the wife. Not one of them said her name. Darnell had seated her in the second row. For space, he'd explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. In case any of your family need room to sit with you. She had no family. He knew she had no family. That was the point. At the repast held at Darnell's enormous house out in Alpharetta, Odessa, carried a tray of deviled eggs she'd made herself out of 40 years of habit, and she heard Yolanda by the catering table dabbing at dry eyes for an audience of her friends. It's just so hard, Yolanda was saying. Losing Daddy. But at least we have each other. The real family. That's what gets you through. The real family. As if Odessa had been playing pretend for 40 years. The reading of the will was set for 1 week after they put Harold in the ground. It was held downtown in the office of Reginald Boyd, the attorney who had handled Harold's estate for the last 2 decades. Odessa dressed carefully that morning, a simple black dress. Her silver hair set the way Harold had always liked it. Her hands shook a little on the wheel driving down, but she told herself there was nothing to be nervous about. 40 years. Surely he had taken care of her. Surely after everything she'd be provided for. Darnell, Yolanda, and Curtis arrived together with 2 lawyers of their own trailing behind them like a weather system. They sat on one side of the long table. Odessa sat alone on the other. Reginald Boyd was a decent man, and she could tell before he said a word that he did not want to be reading what he was about to read. He got through the formalities in a lawyer's careful monotone, and then he got to the numbers. The estate of Harold Bishop is valued at approximately $9.2 million. Odessa felt her shoulders come down from around her ears. 9 million. More than enough. Maybe Harold had been right to keep the money quiet all those years, growing it, protecting it for exactly this. The primary residence in Buckhead. Boyd continued, and his voice got more careful. Not less valued at $2.4 million is left in its entirety to Harold Bishop's children by his first marriage. Darnell Bishop, Yolanda Bishop Prescott, and Curtis Bishop. To be divided equally or sold, and the proceeds split 3 ways as they see fit. The cold started somewhere at the base of Odessa's spine. The house. Her house. The house she'd made a home for 40 years. It wasn't hers. The investment accounts totaling approximately $4.1 million likewise to be divided equally among the 3 children. The cold was in her chest now spreading, and she couldn't get a full breath around it. The retirement and remaining liquid assets approximately $2.1 million, the same distribution. Mr. Boyd? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. What about me? What did Harold leave for me? Boyd looked up, and the pity on his face was the worst thing she'd seen since the coffee cup. I'm getting to your specific bequest, Mrs. Bishop. I want you to know I argued against the language he used. He insisted. I'm sorry. He took a breath and read because he had to word for word. My wife, Odessa May Bishop, has lived in comfort at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing. She has enjoyed my home, my standing, and a life far beyond anything she could have achieved on her own as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has rendered. Each word landed like a hand across the face. Companionship, domestic services. 40 years reduced to the language of a contract that had finally come due. Across the table, Darnell was smiling openly now. Yolanda studied her manicure. Curtis had his eyes down on the table, and his jaw was tight, and he would not look at her, and she didn't have the room in her right then to wonder why. The will continues, Boyd said, and she could hear how much he hated it. While I have appreciated my wife's presence and her management of my household, my first obligation is to my children and my bloodline. To my wife, Odessa May Bishop, I therefore leave the following one property located at 12 Cornelia Row in the town of Beulah, Georgia, together with all its contents. Odessa's head came up. Cornelia, Beulah. For one dizzy second, the room tilted and she thought no. She'd misheard. A grieving mind reaching for anything. There were 100 small towns in Georgia. Cornelia was a name. Beulah was a name, they were common enough. Church names, old names. This bequest is given, Boyd read on, with the express condition that she vacate the Buckhead residence within 30 days. And just like that, the moment passed, buried under the sheer weight of what was happening to her, and she did not let herself hear the two names again. There wasn't room. She was too busy being erased. Yolanda broke the silence with a sympathy so false it curdled the air. "Daddy mentioned that Beulah property to us years back," she said. "Inherited it from some distant relative way out in the middle of nowhere. Said it was a falling down old place, wasn't even worth the taxes." She turned her cold smile on Odessa. "But at least you'll have a roof, Odessa. That's something, isn't it?" Darnell was already standing, already moving on. "We'll want to talk timeline on the Buckhead house. We're listing it right away, mark it strong. Sooner you're out, sooner we can stage it." 30 days, Boyd said, and there was steel in it now. "Mrs. Bishop is entitled to 30 full days. That's not negotiable." "Of course," Darnell said smoothly. "We're not unreasonable. Take your 30 days, Odessa." Boyd slid a brown envelope across the table. His hand wasn't quite steady. "This is the deed to the Beulah property transferred into your name. There's a key and a note. He asked me to include it." Inside was an iron key, old and rusted, the kind that belonged in a movie about 100 years ago, and a single sheet of Harold's heavy cream stationery, his precise hand. "Odessa, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You'll understand everything once you're inside. I couldn't tell you before they were always watching. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love always. Harold, trust me one last time." After he'd sat her in front of these people and had a stranger read her out of his life as adequately compensated help, Odessa stood up on legs that didn't feel like hers. She picked up the envelope. She did not say one word to Darnell or Yolanda or Curtis. She walked to the door. "Mrs. Bishop," Boyd called after her, "if you need anything at all, please call me. I mean that." She nodded without turning around, and she walked out, and she made it all the way to her 10-year-old sedan in the parking garage, before the tears finally came sitting alone in a concrete box, crying until there was nothing left in her. The 30 days were a slow education in cruelty. They came nearly every day, the three of them, with contractors and designers and real estate agents, walking through the rooms of the only home Odessa had known for 4 decades, with measuring tapes and paint swatches, talking about knocking down her walls and tearing out her kitchen and ripping up the gardens she'd planted with her own 2 hands, and they did it all as if she weren't there. As if she were a ghost haunting a house that had nothing to do with her anymore. One morning she stood at the kitchen sink with her coffee and listened to Yolanda tell a designer they'd open all this up, waving a hand at the wall where 40 years of Odessa's family photographs hung. Open concept, that's what sells. Photographs of graduations Odessa had attended, holidays Odessa had cooked, a whole life about to become a comparable property value. But it was Curtis who stopped her cold. On the 12th day, she came in from the garden and found a foil-covered plate on the counter. A plate of food. Still warm. Nobody around. She stood looking at it confused, and then Curtis came around the corner with his car keys already in his hand. "You still gotta eat," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's from that place on Roswell you like. The oxtails." She opened her mouth. She didn't know what was going to come out of it. And then Darnell's voice cut down the hallway. "Curtis, you coming or what?" And something in Curtis's face closed like a door, and he set his jaw and walked out, and she heard the front door shut, and she stood alone in the kitchen with a warm plate of oxtails and no idea what to do with the small, dangerous thing it had made her feel. She scraped it into the trash. She couldn't have said why. On the 28th day, she heard Darnell and Yolanda in the dining room, and they either didn't know she could hear or didn't care. "I honestly can't believe he left her anything," Yolanda was saying. "That Beulah place is worth, what, $50,000. He should have left her nothing at all." "Guilt," Darnell said. 40 years is a long time to string somebody along, even the help. The Beulah place was cheap enough to ease his conscience without touching what's ours. Well, she should be grateful we're being civilized. Most women her age, no skills, no family, she'd be in county housing or a shelter. At least she can sell that dump, have a little cushion for whatever's left. And they laughed. Together. The easy laughter of people who had never once in their lives lain awake wondering about rent. Odessa gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles went pale and she wanted to scream, and she wanted to walk into that dining room and tell them exactly what she thought of them, 40 years of it all at once. She didn't. 40 years of swallowing it held her tongue even now. But something had changed in her standing at that sink. The fear was still there. The grief was still there. But underneath it, for the first time, Something small and hard and quiet had begun to set like concrete. She had nothing left to lose but her dignity, and she would be damned if she'd let them have that too. On her last morning, she walked through every room of the Buckhead house, and she waited to feel the loss of it. It didn't come. The bedroom where she'd slept beside Harold for 40 years was just a room. The guest rooms she'd kept like shrines for children who barely visited were just rooms. The formal living room where she'd played hostess to people who never saw her, the kitchen where she'd cooked 10,000 unthanked meals, rooms all of them. The only place that hurt was the garden. She stood among the roses she'd put in that first hopeful spring in the herb beds she'd built from love of cooking and the perennials she'd arranged, so something would bloom every month from March to November. This was the one place in 40 years that had felt like it was actually hers. And now it would belong to strangers who'd never know the woman who made it, who would call it overgrown and bring in a crew to tear it out. She loaded the car at 1 o'clock. 2 suitcases. 1 box of things that were actually hers, photographs from before her marriage. Her mother's letters, a Bible that had belonged to Grandma Cornelia, with names written in the front in a hand 100 years old. And the wedding photo off the mantel, which Darnell had told her was technically house property, and which she took anyway. Darnell arrived at 1:30 to make sure she left on time. "Movers come at 2, he said, not looking at her. "I'll drop the house keys with Boyd this afternoon." She turned to him at the door, and she heard herself say in a voice quiet but weighted with something she hadn't known she had, "Darnell, do you have any idea what it's like to give somebody 40 years of your life and be told it meant nothing?" His face went red. "He left you a property. That's not nothing." "Your father left me a mystery," she said. "A house I've never seen in a town I've never heard of. You got millions of dollars and this home and the peace of knowing your father called you his legacy. I got a rusted key and 30 days to disappear." She picked up her box. "So no, I don't believe you have the first idea." She got in her car before he could answer, before she could say the rest of it, before the numbness that had gotten her through 30 days could crack all the way open. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat next to her purse. Her GPS glowed with an address she'd punched in without hope. 12 Cornelia Row, Beulah, GA. 2 hours and 40 minutes to a future she couldn't picture. She started the car and drove away from Buckhead, from the columns and the lawn, from the life she'd thought she was living. And as she got onto the highway heading south and east out of the city and toward whatever was waiting, Odessa May Bishop made herself one promise. Whatever she found at the end of this road shelter, or ruin a little money or nothing at all, she would survive it. She was 64 years old with nothing left to lose, and she was beginning to understand that having nothing left to lose is its own strange kind of freedom. Beulah, Georgia was every bit as small as Yolanda had promised. Main Street was maybe a dozen buildings around a little square, a general store with a faded green awning, a diner with gingham in the windows, a post office you could have mistaken for a shed, a white church with a modest steeple, a brick library that looked like it had been there since Reconstruction. But something was wrong, and it took Odessa a slow minute to name it. People were watching her car, not with suspicion, not the way a small southern town sometimes watches a stranger. An old man sweeping the walk in front of the general store paused and lifted his hand in a small, certain wave. A woman setting out flowers at the diner turned and nodded slow, like she was confirming something to herself. 2 teenagers looked up from their phones and just looked curious, like they'd been told to keep an eye out. Recognition. That was the word. They looked at her like they knew her. Her GPS took her off Main Street, and that was when she saw the sign. A green street sign, ordinary as anything, at the mouth of a dirt road that ran off into a stand of oaks. White letters on green. Cornelia Row. Odessa's foot came off the gas without her telling it to. Cornelia, her grandmother's name. The name in the front of that 100-year-old Bible on the seat beside her. The name Grandma Cornelia said had come down through the Freeman women, like the land itself, all the way back to Beulah. No, she made herself breathe. It was a common name, an old church name. Beulah was a hymn. Half the black towns in Georgia had a Beulah something. It was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence because the alternative made no sense at all. But her heart was pounding, and she couldn't have said why. She turned onto the dirt road. The oaks closed over her ancient things with trunks 200 years thick, their branches meeting overhead in a green tunnel that broke the sunlight into moving pieces across her windshield. The road ran on longer than she expected, a mile, maybe more. And just as she started to wonder if the GPS had lost its mind out here, a figure came walking toward her out of the trees. An old woman, 70 if she was a day, but moving with purpose, a cotton house dress and a wicker basket over one arm covered with a checkered cloth. She walked right up to the car and stood by the window and looked in at Odessa with eyes that were bright and steady and full of something that hadn't been said yet. Odessa rolled the window down. "You're Odessa," the woman said. It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say a thing you've been holding in your mouth, a long time waiting. "Yes," Odessa managed. How did you know that?" The old woman's face did something complicated, warmth and grief, and underneath it all a strange brimming patience like a woman standing at the end of a 40-year wait. "Child," she said softly, "we have been expecting you longer than you would ever believe." And she reached into the basket and set a green branch of fresh pecans on the passenger seat right on top of the brown envelope, and Odessa looked down at it, and the whole world went very quiet. Odessa got out of the car on legs that didn't feel steady, the pecan branch still lying across her lap where the old woman had set it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you." "Not yet." The woman held out a hand worn soft with age. "Ruby Mercer, I run the general store back in town, and I have been keeping your grandmother's house ready for you for a long, long while." Your grandmother's house. Odessa heard the words. She just couldn't make them fit anywhere. "There's a mistake," she said. "This is my late husband left me a property here. Harold Bishop, a man I was married to for 40 years. I think you've got me confused with somebody." Ruby's face did that complicated thing again, the warmth and the grief folding together. "No, baby," she said gently. "No mistake. Come on, let me show you. The house is unlocked. Harold never did lock it, said there was nothing here anybody in Beulah would steal, and if somebody needed shelter, they were welcome to it." She started up the road. "Come on now. You've waited long enough. You just don't know it yet." And Odessa, who had spent 40 years following people who were sure of themselves, followed her up the dirt road through the oaks. The trees opened onto a clearing, and Odessa stopped walking. Yolanda had said a falling down old place. Yolanda had said a dump. Yolanda had lied or been lied to because the house standing in that clearing was one of the most beautiful things Odessa had ever seen. It was old stone gray fieldstone that had to date back 150 years laid by hand. 2 stories under a steep slate roof that looked sound as the day it was set. White trim around windows of old leaded glass. A heavy oak door under a little covered porch with carved wooden posts. Ivy climbed the stone, but it climbed the way ivy does when somebody's been tending it, shaped deliberate like something off a postcard of the English countryside. The grounds were overgrown, but even the overgrowth had bones. She could see the shape of old formal gardens under the wild stone paths half swallowed by grass beds where roses had gone feral and glorious. A dry stone fountain standing quiet in the center of it all. And down the slope past the gardens and orchard, rows of enormous old trees, their lowest branches nearly brushing the ground, heavy and green. Pecan trees, so old their branches touched the ground. Something moved at the back of Odessa's mind, an old woman's voice, a bedtime story. She pushed it down. "How much would a place like this even be worth?" she said mostly to herself, dazed. Ruby just smiled and put the iron key in the lock, and it turned smooth as butter despite all its rust, and she pushed the heavy door open. "Harold called it the keeping place," Ruby said. "Come see what he was keeping." Odessa stepped across the threshold, and her whole understanding of her own life shifted under her feet. The house wasn't decrepit. It wasn't abandoned. It was cared for down to the last inch. Wide plank floors that glowed with the deep patina of decades of somebody's hands and somebody's oil. A great stone fireplace with a mantel carved from a single beam of oak. Good furniture, simple and worn soft, a leather sofa, deep chairs set to catch the light walls of built-in shelves full of leather-bound books, hand-woven rugs and soft faded colors. And everywhere on every shelf, every surface covering nearly every foot of wall, there were photographs. Photographs of Odessa. She turned slowly in the middle of the room, and her own face turned with her. Odessa on her wedding day, 25 years old, carrying pecans so full of hope it hurt to look at. Odessa kneeling in the Buckhead garden with dirt on her hands and pure joy on her face. Odessa laughing at something out of frame, caught mid-laugh. Odessa reading in a chair with the afternoon sun in her hair. Odessa asleep on a porch she'd never seen in her life, this porch, this house. Dozens of them. Odessa at every age and every season in 100 unguarded moments across 40 years. All of them framed with care. All of them arranged like a private museum built by a man who came here alone month after month and lived inside her face. "He loved you very much," Ruby said quietly from the doorway. Anybody who ever set foot in here knew it inside of a minute. This was his well. He called it the keeping place. I always thought of it as his church. Odessa's eyes filled, and for the first time since she'd found him cold in that bed, the tears came without shame behind them. She'd been too shocked at the funeral, too numb at the will, too frightened through 30 days of being erased. But here, standing in the middle of 40 years of evidence that Harold Bishop had treasured her, that he had built an entire secret sanctuary out of her face, something in her finally broke clean open. Ruby let her cry. Then she came and took her by the arm gently, the way you handle something precious and cracked, and sat her down on the worn leather sofa. "Let me show you the rest," Ruby said. "And then there's a letter you need to read. He's been waiting to say some things to you for a very long time." Ruby walked her through the house like a woman who'd walked it 100 times. The kitchen was a marriage of old and new, an antique wood stove beside a modern range, copper pots on a rack, a deep farmhouse sink, open shelves of dishes Odessa had never seen. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms simple and comfortable, and more photographs, dozens more some she'd never known existed. Candid shots, her in ordinary moments taken by a man she'd never once seen holding a camera. "When did he even take these?" she whispered, standing in front of a photo of herself she had no memory of. Snapping green beans on a summer afternoon years and years ago. "Little camera he kept in his coat," Ruby said. "He'd show me on his phone, too, later on. Every time he came through town, he'd stop at the store and we'd talk, and he'd show me a new picture of his Odessa and ask me, every time, did I think the house was ready? Was there anything more that ought to be done to make it right for you?" They came back downstairs and Ruby stopped her. "The place has been kept up all these years through a fund Harold set with the bank in town," she said. "Taxes, utilities, the roof, the repairs, all of it paid ahead. 50 years, he said. You'll never have to worry about the cost of this house for the rest of your life." "But why?" Odessa's voice cracked on it. "Why keep it a secret for 40 years? Why let me think? Why let me sit in that office and hear myself called domestic services? Why let his children get everything and me get nothing, when this was here the whole time?" Ruby's face went very still and very kind. "Because of his children," she said. "That's the short of it, but the long of it is in the letter. Come on." She led Odessa to a door under the staircase that Odessa hadn't even noticed. She opened it onto a small windowless study, maybe 10 feet by 12. 3 walls of built-in shelves floor to ceiling, but instead of books, they held folders and binders and document boxes, hundreds of them, every one labeled in Harold's precise hand. The 4th wall held a beautiful old mahogany desk, a green-shaded banker's lamp, a leather chair worn smooth from use. And in the exact center of the desk sat Square Deliberate, waiting a thick cream envelope sealed with actual wax with 2 words across the front in her husband's writing. "My Odessa." "That," Ruby said softly, "is what he really left you. Everything else is just the box it came in." She stepped back toward the door. "I'll be out on the porch. Take your time. Take all the time in the world." And she pulled the door most of the way shut and left Odessa alone with her husband's last words. Odessa picked up the envelope with hands that shook so hard she nearly dropped it. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 5 pages, both sides covered in Harold's precise hand. She sat down in his chair in the ring of green lamplight, and she began to read. "My dearest, my most beloved Odessa, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found the keeping place. I am so sorry it had to happen this way. I am sorry I could not bring you here while I was alive. I am sorry for what you had to sit through in that office. Please, before anything else, please understand that not one word of that, Will, was true." She stopped, read it again. "Not one word of that, Will, was true. I wrote it that way on purpose, my love, with calculation and with intent, because I knew Darnell and Yolanda and Curtis would read every word of it, looking for something to fight something to overturn some way to take back anything I gave you. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. The visible money, the obvious house, the things they could brag about. And I made sure the cruelest possible words were on the page so that they would read them and be satisfied and look no further. I needed them to believe they had won everything. It was the only way to keep them from looking for you. I gave them a Buckhead house that is mortgaged past what they know wrapped in historic preservation covenants. I built into the deed years ago that will cost them a fortune to hold and take years to sell. I gave them trust accounts locked so tight they'll need a court and a saint to open them. I gave them exactly enough rope des, and they took it smiling. But to you, my love, I gave everything that ever actually mattered." Odessa pressed her hand flat against her mouth. You are sitting in a house that is yours, has been yours legally and completely since long before I died, in a form no court on earth can touch. You are surrounded by every photograph I ever took of you, because you were the only true thing in a life that was otherwise all performance and obligation. You were the best of me. You were the only good real thing I ever had, and I spent 40 years too much of a coward to say so out loud to the people whose opinion I valued more than I should have. I failed you in life, Odessa, by being weak. I let my children's judgment matter. I let the world's opinion matter. I chose keeping the peace over standing up for the woman I loved over and over for 40 years, and you paid for my cowardice every single day and never once complained. I have no excuse. I only have this house and what I did with it, and I pray it says what I was too weak to say. The tears were coming so fast now she had to hold the pages away to keep from ruining them. 40 years. 40 years she'd believed there was a room in him she couldn't get into, a distance she couldn't cross, a part of himself he kept locked away from her. And it turned out the locked room was full of her. He had loved her. He had loved her the whole time. He'd just been too much of a coward to let anyone watch him do it. And so he'd come here month after month and loved her in secret, in a house made of her face, and let her believe for 40 years that she wasn't quite enough. She didn't know in that moment whether she wanted to hold him or hit him. She would find in the weeks to come that the answer was both, and that both could be true at once, and that this was simply what it was to love a flawed man.
But right then in that chair, all she could do was cry. Great racking 40 years in coming sobs for a love she'd had all along and never known she had. She cried until she was hollow, and then she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and let out a long breath and looked around the little study at the hundreds of labeled folders, and a cold thought slid in under the warmth. Even this, she thought, they'll find a way. Men like Darnell always find a way. Give it a year, and they'll be down here with lawyers arguing this house is a marital asset, and they'll take even this from me too, because that's what they do. That's all they've ever done. She almost set the letter down. She almost stopped there with the sweetness of it and let herself just be loved for one night before the world came for it. But there were 3 more pages, and through the cracked door from the porch, she heard Ruby say something to somebody passing. On the road, heard her say clear as anything, "No, that's the Freeman place, always has been." Odessa went still. The Freeman place. Her hand stopped moving on the page. She sat there in the lamplight and felt the small hairs rise on her arms, and she got up and pushed the study door open and looked out down the hall to where Ruby stood in the front doorway with the evening behind her. "What did you just say?" Odessa's voice didn't sound like her own. "You said the Freeman place. How do you know that name? How do you know my grandmother's name?" Ruby turned around, and the patience in her face had gone soft and terrible, a woman at the end of a long, long wait. "Read the rest of the letter, baby," she said quietly. "It's not my place. It's his. He's been waiting 40 years to tell you himself." Odessa went back into the study. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. She sat down. She picked up the pages with both hands, and she read on. "Now, my darling, I have to tell you the true thing. The thing this whole house was built to say. Beulah is not my land. It never was. It is yours." Odessa stopped breathing. "It is Freeman land, Odessa. Your grandmother's land. Her grandmother's before her. It belonged to the first Cornelia Freeman, born enslaved freed in 1865, who by 1871 held the deed to 160 acres in her own name in the state of Georgia. A thing so rare in that time, it was nearly a miracle. She named the town Beulah after the promised land in the old hymn, and the Freemans held it and worked it and passed it down mother to daughter for 90 years, until 1962 when it was taken. You told me the story once in the dark in the 2nd year of our marriage. You said, one day it was ours, and the next day it wasn't, and we scattered. You did not know how. Your grandmother would never tell you the whole of it. I found out the whole of it, Odessa. It is my profession. It took me the better part of a year going through the county records, and what I found broke my heart and lit a fire in me that has not gone out in 40 years. The pages were shaking now. She could barely hold them. They took it the way they took so much black land in this country. A tax sale nobody was properly notified of. a courthouse full of men who all knew each other. A little intimidation on the side, a burned barn, a visit in the night to make sure the family understood not to fight it in a court that would never have heard them anyway. By the time the dust settled, the Freeman land had been carved up and passed to men whose grandsons still have their names on the mailboxes in that county. And your people scattered north and gone, and your grandmother carried the deed number in her head to her grave and told her granddaughter bedtime stories about a place she'd never see again. I could not give you back your mother, Odessa. I could not give you back your grandmother or the years or the childhood you should have had on your own land. But I am a real estate lawyer, and buying land is the one thing on this earth I know how to do. So I decided in 1986 that I would give you back Beulah, one piece at a time. She set the letter down on the desk flat, both hands pressed over it, and she looked up and out the little study door, down the hall, through the front windows at the world outside, going gold in the last of the light. The pecan trees, so old their branches touched the ground. The stone well, she could just see past the garden where a girl could once have looked down and seen her own face. The road with her grandmother's name on the sign. And she thought all at once of the little mason jar on the shelf in his forbidden office, half full of yeep red dirt. From a client's property, he'd told her. Sentimental value. His, not mine. It had been from here. It had been this red Georgia clay carried 3 hours home in a jar so he could keep a piece of her land on his shelf and look at it every day and never ever say what it was. This is the place. This is the place in the stories. The place Grandma Cornelia sang about. I'm not in some stranger's house he happened to inherit. I'm home. I've been standing in the middle of home this whole time. The house was so quiet, she could hear the ice she'd never poured, hear her own blood, hear 40 years rearrange themselves behind her. Ruby was standing in the study doorway now. Odessa hadn't heard her come. The old woman's eyes were wet and shining. He bought back the first 40 acres in the spring of 1986, Ruby said softly. 3 months after you told him the story. He kept every trip quiet. Told you he was going fishing. Her mouth trembled into something that was almost a smile. 40 years, baby. Piece by piece, deed by deed, from every man who'd ever profited off what was stole from your family. Every August he closed on another parcel, and he'd come home and lay a pecan branch on your kitchen counter because he couldn't tell you what he'd done, and it was the only way he had to say it. The pecans. 40 Augusts of pecans. Odessa put both hands over her face, and behind them she was laughing and weeping at the same time, the sound tearing out of her because it was too much. It was 40 years too much, the cruelty and the tenderness, the theft and the return, the coward and the quiet patient. 40-year courage of the man she'd buried without ever knowing who he really was. All of it, she finally managed, lowering her hands. He got all of it back. Ruby nodded slowly. Every last acre, she said. The Freeman land is whole again, Odessa. 160 acres, and every deed's got one name on it. Whose? Odessa whispered, though she already knew, though the whole house had been telling her since she walked through the door. Ruby smiled through her tears. Yours, baby, she said. It always was. Odessa spent her first 2 weeks in Beulah in a kind of daze, learning a man she'd been married to for 40 years all over again from the outside in. Everyone in that town had a Harold story. Pastor Elias Grant, a broad, kind man in his 60s, told her Harold had paid for the entire new roof on the church 3 summers back and forbidden them to put his name on so much as a bulletin. Said a house of worship needs a sound roof to shelter its people, and that was reason enough. Wouldn't hear another word about it. Mrs. Della Watkins, who'd lived in Beulah her whole life, took Odessa's hands in both of hers and told her Harold had quietly paid her grandson's way clean through Morehouse. Set it up like a scholarship so we wouldn't feel it as charity. But we knew. First boy in our family with a degree. Changed his whole life. Sarah Coleman, the young woman who ran the little library, said that when the county cut the branch's budget to nothing, Harold had walked in one afternoon and written a check for 5,000 new books. Said a town without books isn't rightly a town. Here in Beulah, Harold Bishop had been generous, open-handed present. Here he'd been the man he wanted to be instead of the man his Atlanta life and his first wife's family and his own fears had made him. And Odessa was glad of it. She was. But some nights she'd sit out on the stone porch with a cup of tea, going cold in her hands, and under the gladness there'd be something else, something harder that she made herself look at, instead of swallowing the way she'd swallowed everything for 40 years. She was angry. She was angry that he could be this here brave and open and kind out loud and never once be it for her where it counted in the rooms where his children sneered and his colleagues looked through her. She was angry that he'd let her sit in Reginald Boyd's office and hear herself called domestic services when he'd spent 40 years buying back her family's stolen home. She was angry that his courage had a lock on it and that she'd never once been given the key while he was alive to hand it to her. He was a coward, she said to Ruby one evening plain, because she was done pretending. A good man and a coward. Both. He gave me back the whole world and couldn't stand up for me at a dinner table. Ruby didn't argue. Ruby, she was learning, never argued with a true thing. Yes, the old woman said simply. He was both. Most of us are baby. The trick is what you build with the good part before you run out of time. She looked out at the darkening orchard. He built you this. Took him 40 years, and he never got to see your face when you found it. That's the price he paid for the coward part. Seems to me it's a heavy enough price. But you're the one gets to decide that. Not me, and not him anymore. Odessa sat with that a long time. She decided she could love him and stay angry at him at the same time. She decided she didn't have to choose. It turned out to be the most honest thing she'd felt in 40 years. It was on the 15th day that she opened the folders. She'd been circling that little study the way you circle a hot stove. But Harold's letter had told her the answers were in there, and one morning she made a pot of coffee and sat down at the mahogany desk and started to read. The first cabinet was the deeds. 40 years of them, one parcel at a time, every closing dated, every August accounted for. And the trust and irrevocable trust Harold had established in her name in 1986, a fortress of a legal instrument into which he'd folded every acre as he bought it. She wasn't a lawyer, but she'd been a lawyer's wife for 40 years, and she understood enough to understand this. The land was hers, in a way that no marriage, no divorce, no death, and no grasping stepchild could ever undo. He'd built it that way from the very first parcel, before he'd even told her he loved her out loud. It had been waiting whole and untouchable the entire time. The second cabinet made her sit back in the chair. It was the children's inheritance documented down to the comma. And it was not what Darnell and Yolanda thought they'd won at all.
The Buckhead house carried a mortgage Harold had taken against it just 2 years before he died, a big one that the heirs would inherit, right along with the columns and the lawn. The historic covenants he'd mentioned in the letter were real and airtight. Any sale would have to crawl through committee reviews and impact studies that could take a year or more. The investment trusts released their money in slow condition trickles tied to employment and annual reviews by an independent trustee, a retired judge known across 3 counties for taking ethics personally.
Harold had given his children exactly what they wanted in exactly the shape that would make it a misery to hold. It wasn't a fortune. It was a beautifully wrapped anvil.
And then in the very back of that second cabinet, in a plain folder with no drama to it at all, she found the thing she had not gone looking for.
A loan document from 4 years back. Harold's signature on the bottom, except it wasn't. She'd seen her husband sign his name 10,000 times over 40 years at the bottom of Christmas cards and closing papers and restaurant checks, and this was not his hand. It was a careful, practiced forgery, and clipped behind it in Harold's own writing was a single note.
Darnell, handled quietly, kept for the record, H.B. Odessa sat very still. Her husband had known. His oldest son had forged his name on a loan, a crime, a real one, the kind with handcuffs behind it, and Harold had cleaned it up quietly and never said a word, and kept the proof in a folder for the record. For a moment she felt the old, cold satisfaction rise up in her 40 years of swallowed remarks with a taste of blood on the back of them. She could end Darnell with this. One phone call. She could take everything from him the way he'd tried to take everything from her. She closed the folder. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it, but she knew sitting there that she wasn't going to become them to beat them. That much she knew. She wasn't surprised when the Mercedes came up the dirt road. It was the third week. Reginald Boyd had called 2 days before to warn her Darnell had retained lawyers, was arguing the Beulah land was a marital asset, was asking a court to force a sale and split it 4 ways. Boyd had helped Harold build the trust. He knew it would hold. "But I wanted you ready," he'd said. "They're expensive and they're aggressive. It could get ugly." "I've had 40 years of ugly from those people," Odessa had told him. "I believe I can manage 3 more weeks of it." She watched from an upstairs window as the car came out of the Oaks and stopped, and all 3 of them got out and stood there. Darnell, Yolanda Curtis, looking around at the stone house and the orchard and the tended grounds, with faces that went from smug to confused to something like fear. This was not the dump they'd been promised. This was not a woman they'd left with nothing. She let them knock. Then she came down and opened the heavy oak door herself, calm as Sunday. "Hello, Darnell, Yolanda Curtis." She stepped back. "Come in, I'll put on some tea." She served them in the front room in the good china she'd found in the kitchen cabinets, and she let them sit surrounded by 40 years of photographs of her own face while she poured. She watched them take it in the quality of the place, the beauty of it, and worst of all for them, the ease with which she moved through it. She wasn't broken, she wasn't desperate. She was home and radiating a quiet they'd never once seen in her. Darnell cleared his throat. "Odessa, we came to talk about the property. We think there's been a misunderstanding about what this place is worth." "Have you?" She sat unhurried. "Our father clearly didn't grasp the value when he willed it to you," Yolanda said, and there was the old ice sharpening as she found her footing. "Now that we've had it looked into the land, the acreage, it's worth considerably more than anyone knew. As his children and primary heirs, we believe we're entitled to a share of any significant marital asset. This should be divided 4 ways. "It isn't a marital asset," Odessa said. "It was placed in a trust in my name in 1986, long before it could be anything of the kind. I have the documents, every one." "We don't believe that's binding," Curtis said, and it startled her because it was Curtis, and because he didn't sound like he believed it either. He said it the way a man reads a line somebody handed him. He wouldn't look at the photographs. "Then I suppose you'll take me to court," Odessa said mildly. And here the outline of her old life told her was where she reached for the folder. Here was where she laid Darnell's forgery on the coffee table like a loaded gun and watched the blood drain out of his face and made them crawl. She had it ready. She'd brought it downstairs. It sat in her lap. But she found in that moment, sitting in her grandmother's house with her grandmother's Bible on the shelf, that she did not want to build the first thing she did with Beulah out of the same poison they'd have used on her. So instead, she set her teacup down and she looked at the 3 of them and she told them the truth. "Let me tell you what this place is," Odessa said, "since your father never got the chance." And she told them. The first Cornelia Freeman, born enslaved, freed, holding the deed to 160 acres in her own name in 1871, the town she named for the promised land, 90 years of her people working it and passing it down mother to daughter. And 1962, the tax sale. Nobody was told about the courthouse full of men who knew each other. The barn burned in the night to make sure the family understood not to fight. And a girl growing up hundreds of miles away on bedtime stories about a home she'd never see. "That girl was me," Odessa said. "This was my family's land. It was stolen. And your father, the man you're so sure loved only his bloodline, spent 40 years, and God knows how much of his own money buying it back from me. 1 piece every August for 40 years. That's where he was, Darnell, on all those fishing trips you never questioned. He was down here in Georgia at closing tables, buying back what this country took from my grandmother, so that one day it could come home to me. And he never told a living soul in Atlanta because he knew that the 3 of you would find a way to take even this." The room was dead silent. Even the antique clock on the mantel seemed to hold its breath. "So here is my offer, and it's the only one I'll make." She kept her voice even. "Walk away. Take the will exactly as it was written, the house and the trusts and all the strings your father tied to them, and believe me, you'll find the strings soon enough. Leave me my grandmother's land, and we never have to see each other again. And if we don't, Darnell's voice had an edge, but it had gone thin. Odessa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the folder in her lap. She thought about the forged signature and the handcuffs behind it and how easy it would be. And she chose. "Then you'll lose," she said simply. "The trust will hold your own father's lawyer built it, and he'll testify to that. You'll spend money you're about to find out you don't have on a case you cannot win. That's all. That's the whole threat, Darnell. You'll lose in court like anybody who fights the truth." She did not reach for the folder. She left the forgery where it was unspoken, unused. She knew about it. She would always know about it. And she decided right there that knowing was enough, that she would keep it the way Harold had, quietly for the record, and never build her new life on the ruin of a man, even a man like Darnell. "Your father was too much of a coward to stand up for me while he was alive," she said. "I've decided I'm not going to be a coward now that he's gone. So I'm not going to destroy you. I'm just going to keep what's mine." Darnell stood up too fast. His chair scraped. His face was red and closed, and she understood that a man like Darnell would rather be threatened than forgiven, because forgiveness made him small in a way a threat never could. "We'll discuss this privately," he said. "Of course, take all the time you need." She rose to see them out. "But understand me. This land is mine. It was always going to be mine. Your father loved you in his complicated way. But he loved me too. He was just too afraid to say so until he was gone." It was Curtis who lingered. Darnell was already at the car. Yolanda was halfway across the yard, and Odessa had seen, when she told the story of 1962, something flicker across Yolanda's sharp face. Not softness exactly, but a crack. Odessa would learn later from Curtis what was behind it. 3 children raised by a grandmother who taught them daily that their father's second wife was beneath them, that a woman like Odessa was a stain to be managed. They'd been handed their cruelty like an inheritance of its own before they were old enough to refuse it. It didn't excuse them, but it explained the shape of them, and Odessa found she was old enough now to hold both of those things at once, too. Curtis stopped in the doorway. "The oxtails," he said, and then stopped like he didn't know how to go on. "That day, I brought you the oxtails. I remember. Darnell called me and I just left." He looked at the floor. "I've been leaving my whole life. Whenever it got hard, whenever they got loud, I just went along because it was easier than being the one who said something." He finally raised his eyes to hers. "He really came down here for 40 years. "He did." Curtis looked past her into the front room at the wall of her face in the lamplight. And something in him came apart quietly, the way a man comes apart who spent his whole life not looking at a thing. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. I know it's not worth much this late, but I'm sorry." Odessa looked at Harold's youngest son a long moment. "It's a start," she said. And she meant it as a door left open just a crack, the way somebody had once left a plate of warm food on a counter for a woman everybody else had decided to erase. He nodded and went to the car, and they drove away down the dirt road, the expensive Mercedes looking absurd and out of place under the ancient oaks. Odessa stood on her porch and watched them go. Then she went inside and sat in the chair by the window. And for the first time since Harold died, she cried tears that were neither grief nor rage nor shock, but something quieter and cleaner underneath all 3. They dropped the suit within a week. Ruby came by that evening with a pie. Odessa had been meaning to ask her a question for 2 weeks and had been almost afraid to. But there was one more sealed envelope Harold had left in the very back of the desk marked "For Odessa" when the dust settles, and she'd opened it that afternoon, and now she knew, and she needed to hear the old woman say it. "Ruby," she said when they were settled on the porch, "that first day, you knew my grandmother's maiden name. You knew this was the Freeman place. How?" Ruby set her fork down. Her eyes were bright. "Because it's mine too, baby," she said. "The Freeman name." Odessa went still. Cornelia Freeman, that held the first deed, she had a brother. Stayed on in this county when the rest of the family scattered in 62. Kept his head down, kept his name quiet, but he stayed. Ruby's voice was trembling now. "That was my great-grandfather. Your grandmother, Cornelia, and my grandmother were first cousins, which makes you and me family," Odessa breathed. "Blood," Ruby said, and reached over and took Odessa's hand in both of her worn ones. "You came down here thinking you didn't have a soul left in this world, and you drove straight into the last of your own people, keeping the store on your own family's land, waiting for you to come home. Harold knew. It's the last thing he wrote in that letter to me years back. Watch for her. She's the last Freeman that doesn't know she's a Freeman. When she comes, don't let her be alone another day. Odessa. May Bishop. Odessa May Freeman sat on the porch of her grandmother's house and held her cousin's hand, and understood that the man who'd been too weak to give her his courage in life had in death given her back every single thing she'd ever lost. Her land, her name, her people. Even the family she'd been so sure was gone. 6 months later, the pecan trees were heavy with the fall crop, and Odessa was up to her elbows in her grandmother's garden. She'd had the well cleaned out, you could see your face in it again, just like in the stories. She'd cleared the stone paths and coaxed the wild roses back into their beds. She'd kept every photograph of herself exactly where Harold had hung it, and added her own choices alongside them, her mother's letters framed on the wall, a 100-year-old deed with the first Cornelia Freeman's name on it hung where the light would catch it every morning. She went to church on Sundays and sat in a pew where people knew her name. She and Ruby ate supper together most nights, two cousins at the end of a long road, laughing in a kitchen that had held their family for 150 years. Curtis called now and then. He'd driven down twice. It was as she'd told him a start. That last sealed envelope had held one more thing: a deed to a smaller property at the edge of town, and papers for a fund, $600,000 set aside in Harold's words, for whatever you decide to build with the rest of your life. You spent 40 years living mine. Go and live yours. She knew exactly what she wanted to build. She was going to turn the extra property into a place for women like her older black women who'd spent their whole lives holding up everybody else and been thrown away for the trouble. A place for widows, for women starting over with nothing, for anyone who needed a roof and a garden and time to remember who they were underneath everyone they'd taken care of. And she was going to use the rest of the fund and everything Harold had taught her about deeds and courthouses and patience to help other black families do the one impossible thing he'd done for her: find the land that was stolen from them and take it back. She'd call it Freeman House. On the mantel, she kept one photograph of Harold. Some evenings she looked at it a good long while. The coward and the builder, the silence and the 40 years of Augusts, the man she'd never fully forgive and never stop loving both at once forever. And some evenings when the anger came up in her clean and honest, the way she'd finally let it, she'd reach over and turn the frame a little to the side. Loved, still angry, both true. She was 64 years old. She had spent 4 decades being exactly what everyone else needed her to be. And she was only now on her own land, under her own name, finding out who she'd been underneath it the whole time. To her great surprise, at 64, she was just getting started. They stole my family's land in 1962. My husband spent 40 years buying back every acre and never once told me. Some love is loud, and some love digs in the dirt in silence for 40 years.